Well, I want to thank Lewis and EdSource for putting together this amazing conference and getting all of you here bright and early in the morning to learn about our finances and budgets and all the other parts of our state work, and also my terrific team of colleagues at LPI who are assisting with the conference. And I want to also thank Mac Taylor for being such a good teacher. I learned all kinds of things I didn't understand before this morning. I really want to listen in on the conversation that Mac and Mike are having now to debate the charts, because I want to know the nuances. But that was a very, very helpful and sobering explication of where we are in the state. And it really leads to what I want to talk about. We're framing this issue of accountability. And what do we mean by accountability? In the last 10 or 15 years, we've kind of had a view of accountability that was increasingly about measurement and punishment. What are the sanctions that would occur based on what indicators, changes in test scores over a year and a course of time, without much idea of what the state's accountability to the citizens is. It was the school's accountability to the state to move the needle on test scores. But the Constitution has a different idea about accountability, that the state is responsible. There's a fundamental accountability. The state is responsible to citizens for providing education. Sound basic education or free appropriate public education. In California's case, free common schools, which are for a general diffusion of knowledge and intelligence that is essential to the rights and liberties of the people. And so at the core of that kind of definition of accountability is the idea that we need adequate resources that are wisely used to support meaningful learning opportunities. And I would add, delivered by competent professionals. That's kind of what parents want from the accountability system. We want schools that focus on the right kind of learning to help kids be engaged, excited, and ready for the lives they're going to go into, with capable professionals looking after them, adequately resourced with the resources wisely used. And so it's important to remember that fundamental accountability that the people have a right to expect from the system while we are debating the questions of what, in the context of federal legislation and state legislation, is a portion of that, which we call the accountability system, which then gets us back to thinking about what kind of measures and indicators. Fortunately, we are broadening the idea of those measures and indicators so they do begin to take into account some of the things about what kind of services and opportunities are actually provided to kids. What kinds of investments are actually being made in schools? Because if you're just, as Governor Romer used to put it, if you're just measuring or weighing the cow over and over again and you're not feeding the cow, then you're not actually making the kinds of investments that are needed to achieve the goals. And that's been a perennial problem in California, as we saw, can continue to be a problem. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we are, and I want to remind us where we were. So I'm going to ask Franklin if he will remind us about what Max started out with, which was where we started and what we have to build on. See if you can cue that up and make it work.
Directing air traffic in our nation's skies, building the cars we drive, processing our tax returns, and handling tasks vital to our health. These and other critical jobs will likely be performed by the students now attending public schools in California, where 1 of every 8 American children is educated. And that ought to scare every one of us.
We've basically turned our back on schools.
Once a leader in public education, California is now near the bottom.
There's something missing in the system.
Those schools are slums. There's no better word for it.
We're always on a survival level.
Coming up, journalist John Merrow examines how the nation's largest school system fell from first to worst and why that matters to the entire country.
Matt kind of started us at the same place. This is from that John Merrow film, From First to Worst. And we did hit a nadir that we're coming back from, and we're in that process now, which has a lot to do with both what we need to accomplish, the context that we're working from, and the way in which accountability systems need to help us move forward. If you could go to a reminder of what happened when Proposition 13 took hold without the other investments. Franklin, let's see if we can get this one to work.
This executive order will freeze all job hirings and job replacements in the state of California.
California felt the effects of Proposition 13 immediately.
The first firings were announced in San Diego, an across-the-board reduction in all county departments. And what will happen in the schools?
Summer school went away for my second child because that was one of the first things to be cut. And the textbooks became older, and the special services for health became less.
It affected a whole lot of other things, arts programs, music programs, phys ed, language programs, counselors, nurses, librarians, libraries.
They cut the classroom periods from 7 periods to 6 periods, and then some school districts cut to 5 periods. So we actually cut the school day in high school dramatically.
People who came here all through the period of the 80s and into the 90s were shocked at how bad things were in a lot of the schools.
Vote for Proposition 13.
And it goes on to show kind of what happened in the schools, and many of you remember it's not that long ago that we were really scrambling in so many places with crumbling buildings, and one of the frames that comes up talks about the percentage of teachers who were underqualified. A little girl is interviewed about her current teacher who was not yet trained, but she says, well, the last one had been a policeman who would come and take naps during class period after he had assigned a chapter for them to work on. So it got really bad, and we're just climbing up from that. The expenditures, of course, were low and near the bottom of the country in terms of spending, and we're climbing back slightly, but we're still well below national averages and highly unequal. The districts shown there in red back at that time, Compton and Baldwin Park and Franklin McKinley and so on, were predominantly serving students of color and spending under the state average, even though they were serving higher needs students. And then in the midst of all this, No Child Left Behind came and was signed into law in 2002. That look was what a lot of us felt when we read the law and said, oh my goodness, this is going to end up declaring all of the public schools failing within the period of time between now and 2014, with those serving English language learners because of a catch-22 in the law being the first of those to do so. And what we found over that period of time was, in fact, that occurred. The major policy strategy during that era was testing, and in California, that occurred without investing. It did lead, studies showed, to a more road-oriented curriculum, less attention to science. Lots of elementary schools did as little as possible. History, writing, arts and music, physical fitness, research and inquiry, not as much attention to things like social emotional skills. We had continued inequality in resources. So that fundamental accountability, that is to provide a common education that is of some quality, was being neglected even while we were pursuing a kind of accountability that had to do with chasing measurements that weren't being supported. And then, of course, we had a lot of good teachers leaving the profession. We just did a study looking at teacher shortages and teachers leaving nationally. And interestingly, most teachers leave before retirement, most leave for some sort of dissatisfaction with the schools, and the largest source of dissatisfaction in this latest round of federal survey data was accountability pressures, and the rates of leaving were highest for teachers from high poverty, high minority schools where those pressures were the most severe. Teaching to the test and sanctions of various kinds. By 2010, California was one of the lowest spending states overall, one of the most unequally resourced. It is still one of the most segregated states for students. It was 50th in ratios of pupils to teachers and administrators and counselors. We have climbed only a tiny bit. We were in the bottom 5%, bottom 5 states in all of the achievement categories, and we were being penny wise and pound foolish. During that period of time, our prison population quadrupled, corrections costs increased by 900% while we were actually cutting education budgets. We were at a point where we were spending over $50,000 a year to incarcerate young men that we wouldn't spend $10,000 a year on a few years earlier to make sure that they were literate and able to graduate from high school. Huge correlation between high school graduation and incarceration. Most inmates are not graduates, and most are functionally illiterate. And so we got to the point where corrections costs outstripped our investments in public education. And as you heard from Mac, it's not clear that we're out of the woods, that we wouldn't return to this state if we are not really focused on this fundamental aspect of accountability. In the rest of the country, although there was all kinds of emphasis on raising test scores, state test scores did increase in every state because people were working on those and teaching to those tests. But as the RAND Corporation found, 98% of the items on those tests were measuring low-level skills. Very little attention to the higher order skills of thinking, writing, explaining, critiquing. Math, science, and reading scores on PISA, the international assessment, which is a measure that includes a lot more application of knowledge, went down for the country. So the fact that we were going up on low-level skills did not mean that we were improving on higher-level skills. Outcomes did not improve for a lot of reasons. You know, researchers looked at many aspects of this. The state tests did focus on low-level skills. There were very few incentives for enriching the curriculum. The drivers of achievement were invisible because we were only looking at one thing. We were only looking at the test scores. Sometimes the mandated solutions brought to schools were not actually helpful for addressing the problems that schools had, and we often didn't know what the fundamental problem was in the schools because we only knew what their test scores were. The focus on schools and teachers left districts out of the mix, left the state's investments out of the mix. And so when it began to change, and we had the arrival of Governor Jerry Brown, Mike Kirst leading the state board, Tom Torlakson leading the State Department, Bill Honig leading the Instructional Resources Commission, that we saw a major change in both the philosophy and the policy. Mike often refers to this as the rise of the septuagenarians. I think that level of experience and knowledge and commitment from people who had been in the government previously and now understood what needs to move forward has helped us a great deal. And we're on an entirely new path, as you all know. We have a new funding plan, LCFF, local control funding formula. We have new standards in English, math, and science. We have new assessments, at least in English language arts and math. We have a new accountability strategy, a new approach to governance, in which rather than in the old compliance model, we would basically start with policy from the top that would get laid onto the districts with rules and implementation guidelines and then audits and compliance reviews. We're now starting with community involvement as part of the local control accountability plan, where the local board says, here's how we think we're going to achieve the goals that are being set. The state provides the funding for that on a much more equitable basis than in the past. The results are reported to the public. And then with the focus on students, if we don't see gains in the areas that we're monitoring and measuring and paying attention to, we revise both the budgets and the programs that go with those budgets. So it's really intended to create a dynamic system that is always focused on results rather than on compliance, but there's a lot of change to be had as we make that change. Outcomes are beginning to turn the corner. California's graduation rate is now the highest we've ever had at over 80%. The student achievement has grown rapidly. 8th grade students used to be near the bottom, and the rapid increases after 2011, we're almost at the norm, at the national norm in 8th grade reading, making climbs in 8th grade math. College growing rates are beginning to turn upward again. So what do we want in a new accountability system? I would argue that testing does not equal accountability. It is information for an accountability system, which has as its fundamental goal encouraging high-quality teaching and learning, ensuring that people really get a quality education, providing the tools for continuous improvement, and then having ways to identify and address problems that require correction. And so as we've reimagined accountability, we're looking at indicators that reveal students' opportunities to learn, as well as student outcomes. That's a really important concept, that we pay attention to what are kids getting, and which kids are getting what, and how does that translate then into outcomes, and that we assess with the purpose of improving children's opportunities and school outcomes rather than to just apply sanctions. We're all familiar with the state accountability system with the 8 state priorities, which California adopted long before the federal government began to think about a new reauthorization for NCLB. And it did include both achievement and outcome measures and curriculum access and service and parent involvement measures, which are part of that dynamic process that I described, and the commitment to look at opportunities that are provided to children. What is the state actually accountable for providing, and what are counties and districts accountable for doing with that? So on December 11th, No Child Left Behind was left behind. And this is an English teacher cartoon. I was an English teacher in high school. It says, today you're going to learn the meaning of the word irony, because in fact, No Child Left Behind left a lot of children behind in many of the ways that I just described. So now we have a new system that California's been working on. Here comes a new law from the federal government, the Every Student Succeeds Act, which replaced No Child Left Behind. What should we be aiming for? I think, part of the argument that we've undertaken is that we should be offering a 21st century curriculum that's really focused on those higher order skills that kids need to succeed in today's economy. And the assessments need to represent those skills as well, and they should be used to improve teaching and learning. We should create a dashboard of measures that will help us know if a school is struggling, what are the areas in which it is succeeding or struggling? What are the kinds of things that are happening in that school? And that dashboard may include some quantitative measures, but it may also ultimately include a qualitative process, like a school quality review, to look inside the school to understand what's going on as well. We need to highlight and address the opportunity gap. There is this moment every September where all across the country test scores are reported, and I call it the Home Alone moment, where all the politicians go, oh my goodness, we have an achievement gap, as though we didn't know all the reasons that was going to continue to be so, because we haven't been in this country addressing the opportunity gap. The differentials in funding, the differentials in access to curriculum, the differentials in access to well-qualified and competent teachers, which produce that achievement gap year after year after year. We have to be able to pay attention to that. And then finally, we need to develop professional capacity, because everyone who's in the education system has to learn to do things that they haven't had the opportunity to learn to do before, so there's a huge job there. And all of that, I would argue, is part of accountability. It's part of what accountability has to accomplish. We have a new dashboard. This is just one possible representation. People are working on many different ways to look at it. And what's important about this is that in addition to reading and math achievement scores, which are at the bottom of the list, we also propose to look at chronic absenteeism. Why is that important? It's a very strong predictor of whether kids are going to be able to make it through school and graduate. And if you address it productively, it has a huge difference for student outcomes. We propose to look at suspension rates. We know that there's exclusion from school at very high rates in some communities, which are also typically differential by race of students, and those also predict lower graduation rates, lower achievement, finding different ways to manage and support responsible behavior has a huge difference in the outcomes that occur. Local climate surveys, what's happening in the school, what are kids getting access to, how do teachers and students, parents feel about the way in which they are engaged with and supported by the school. This is very important because when teachers have access, and educators as well as parents have access to data about what's happening, how our kids experiencing school, how our parents experiencing their relationships, it's very actionable. You can do something about that year after year after year and say, oh, we're going to work on that. Let's figure out how we're going to approach this issue or that issue. We're talking about, of course, tracking English learner proficiency gains, graduation rates, including extended rates, so that there are incentives for schools if kids are unable to graduate in 4 years because they're credit deficient or became pregnant or were incarcerated or came into the country with less than a full education, that there's an incentive for schools to keep those kids. That's going to make a huge difference to the economy. If we could really get to the place where we were graduating virtually all kids, college and career ready, it would transform the sucking sound on the economy that comes from incarceration and welfare when kids cannot engage in the economy, produce the capacity to get jobs and pay taxes that pay for my Social Security and your health care benefits. I'm worried about that. You know, this is like, it's coming up on us. And so the next indicator is hugely important, college and career readiness. If we can set a goal that 100% of kids will be graduating not aimless, not underprepared, but you know, having had a high quality career preparatory experience and or a high quality college preparatory experience, and increasingly both, which many of the linked learning schools are doing, that would transform opportunities for kids in this country. It would also, or in this state at least, and it would give schools incentives to invest in high quality curriculum, to invest in the right kind of learning opportunities. And then of course, at the end of the day, when we do these things, we can look at English language arts and math scores and so on. So this is a very big investment in educational opportunity to begin to look at multiple measures of how schools are doing this. There are also aspects of the plan that would look at the other state priorities. You know, are kids getting basic services, et cetera, some of that other part of the fundamental state accountability, more in a yes or no kind of way rather than a highly developed indicator, because some of those things are hard to measure. The idea of looking at both improvement and status, this little chart with the red and the blue, where the blue is high and stable or improving, red is low and not improving. In between are different levels of yellow, orange, green for improving at different rates or having a status at different rates. So there's a very interesting way to look at that. I think we may be indebted to children now for kind of conceptualizing ways to look at those data. That also gives us a lot of information about not only what a school is doing, but how is it improving, and where does it need to pay attention. So if as a parent you got that report card for your school, you would see that that red little dashboard icon next to college and career readiness is a place where the school really needs to focus. Or where, if this were a district report card, where that district would need to focus. You could see that the challenge of chronic absenteeism had been well addressed in this school, but there's work to do in a number of other areas. And then underneath that is a lot of other data that allows you to know much more. So I think I just went backwards instead of forwards. Back to the college and career indicator, the notion of these opportunities like college prep and CTE sequences, but also programs like AP and IB and dual credit courses that really get you ready for college. Looking ahead to things like the seal of biliteracy, the Golden State seal of merit diploma. All of these are ways to strengthen curriculum and learning that can translate into the kind of achievement that we want for our kids to be really ready for the world they're coming into. So to sum up, we're now facing a new federal law. The state board is working hard to try to integrate the federal requirements with those from the state that we've been working on. The ESSA law is distinguished by the fact that accountability is to be designed by the states. There are about 15 things the Secretary of Education is not allowed to regulate or prescribe. Multiple measures are actually required. The nature of tests and their uses can change, and that will be discussed later today. Assessments actually must measure higher order skills and may include performance tasks and portfolios. That's a shift from No Child Left Behind. But there are challenges ahead that we'll talk about today. In the regulatory process, the federal proposed regulations, which are still under revision with lots of comments having been filed, should there be a single summative score for every school, sort of like the API used to be in California or the A through F system in some states. Some people look to that for a simple way of categorizing schools, and there may be some virtue in that view. At the same time, lots of simulations and examinations from Vermont to our PACE colleagues here in California have found that when you look only at a single summative score, you're likely to miss schools that are really struggling in some areas, or for some subgroups of students who will not be identified as in need of assistance, even though they may be one of the most problematic schools in the state on certain indicators. So it masks data, even while it may provide some information. So that's a challenge to work through. How do we think about that in California? What kind of weight are given to the non-federal measures? The federal proposed regulations essentially would end up weighting all of those things like suspension rate, school climate, chronic absenteeism, college and career readiness, essentially at zero in a formula that a state might develop, because there are regulations that would mean they couldn't change a school's status in the identification for intervention process. But a lot of people have worked really hard in California to get attention on those kinds of indicators because of the effect that that can have in supporting equity and enabling learning opportunities. So how do we work that through? Of course, as I said, the federal regulations are still in process and being revised. The fixation on percent proficient. There is some language in the proposed regulations that seems to suggest that we should look continually at percent proficient, but that means we're not paying attention to the kids above and below that bubble level, that cut score. And we've learned in the past that that directs attention to the kids, what they call at the bubble, who are near that cut score, and away from the kids who are elsewhere in the continuum. So we have to work on these issues as we transition from what has been a more test and punish to an assess and approve mentality. We have to do all of this work on LCAP and accountability and developing deeper assessments, supporting educator development and system learning so that people can do the work that they are raising their hands to do, and then designing schools that can support these stronger, deeper learning opportunities. So that's the subject not only of today's work, but of the work that we have ahead of us throughout this year. And I leave you with the words of John Dewey, who kind of plagiarized every thought I had before I had it. But I think we need to be guided by this idea as we work our way through these knotty issues. What the best and wisest parent wants for his or her child, that must the community want for all of its children. Any other goal is narrow and unlovely. Acted upon, it destroys our democracy. If we pursue what the best and wisest parent wants, I'm confident we'll end up with a fundamentally redesigned accountability system that does work for our state. Thank you.